I also began this book, and I'll read a few passages from it and then be happy to take any questions. Really, right before I came to Harvard, I had this idea that the very things that were really formative for many of the iconic individuals that inspired me were really improbable foundations, oftentimes failures. And I started to think about this when I would look at the life stories of people like Martin Luther King and saw that he received C's in public speaking class. Not once, but twice, right? In seminary, he was in his formative years. I wonder what that teacher thought of giving him those 2 C's when he went on to become one of our most prodigious orators of his time. And as a teenager, I would look at these life stories and I just thought, we're really not telling the full arc of people's lives. And by depriving ourselves of these full stories, we're missing out on how to give ourselves a better roadmap for how it is that we more fully become. So I had an experience that I wrote about, and which I guess got me into Harvard. And it was about my own failures as a teenager, as I saw it then. And I hid the essay, didn't share it with my parents or guidance counselor because we knew what they would say. You can't send an essay in about failure. And of course, so I was admitted here, but didn't expect that 17 years later, and it is 17 years later, I'd be standing here with a book that's really a continuation of that essay. So what I thought I'd do is read a bit from it. I'm happy to be reading from it and not parroting bits as sound bites, which I'm happy to do on different shows like Late Night with Seth Meyers, but it's really not a how-to book. It's not a manual of sorts. It's really meant to be a work of literature that's a tour through the human heart and mind about this idea that improbable foundations often lead to these iconic rises. So I thought I would begin with the first chapter, give you an excerpt of one of my favorites, and end with the midway point and let you read the rest. Let's see. There are 2 extra seats if it's kind of standing room back there. If you'd like to come up, I'd rather see you sitting than standing. Sure. There's one other seat well, there are 2 more. Okay. So maybe I should just start by saying, though, that this book is one I would not have been able to write if not for curating at MoMA, really working with a lot of creative individuals. But this book is really an atlas of stories that spans both epochs and also disciplines. So it looks at the lives of entrepreneurs as well as artists and inventors. But it was really going to this archery practice one day that got me to understand why I was writing this book. So I'll begin with that description here. This chapter is called Archer's Paradox. The women of the Columbia University archery team stepped out of their van on a cold spring afternoon with a relaxed focus. One held a half-eaten ice cream cone in her right hand and a fistful of arrows with yellow fletching in her left. Another sported a mesh guard over her shirt on top of her breast as protection from the tension line of the bow. Baker Athletic Complex, the university's sporting fields at the northern tip of Manhattan, seemed to have a set of carefree warriors on its grounds. A man who maintains the property never thought they would arrive. Maybe because he was new, he asked where the archery team would practice and looked at me quizzically. He didn't believe that archery was a real Columbia team sport. It was understandable. I'd arrived early and the targets were not yet up. Releasing arrows at up to 150 miles per hour at targets 75 yards away means safety issues for all around, so the archery team doesn't practice next to any other. Mastery of this high-precision sport stays largely out of sight. Coach Derek Davis drove up the archers and greeted me with his elbow leaning against the gray van's driver's side window. His silvery white dreadlocks hung past his shoulders, covered under a blue patterned bandana that matched his Columbia archery sweatshirt. He struck me as a composite fit to match this clan, gregarious and at ease, yet focused. On the phone a few days earlier, he had told me that he first picked up the sport as a casual hobby at his wife's insistence in the late 1980s. She said it was safer than pool and didn't involve alcohol. He has led the varsity intramural club team since 2005 as one part biomechanical expert, one part yogi, a university sage fit for ancient warfare turned sport. The young women smiled and they sized me up a little, then passed as I stood beside the chain-link fence entrance to their designated turf. One threw away her melting cone and joined the others who were unpacking the gear from the band's trunk. They spoke not with words, but by exchanging numbers, their ideal scores or degrees to position themselves to hit their targets. The women were preparing for an upcoming nationals competition. There are no men on this varsity team, only at the intramural level of play. The coach had some theories about this that I didn't get into. I watched as they carefully set down their compound and recurve bows, like those used at the Olympics, with tips that bend away from the archer, then drew and let loose arrows that curved and fell out of sight as they hit the round target face. Davis didn't hover, but stood a good distance behind them, perhaps assessing who might need support. Spread out, further off at the edge of the turf, were toolkits filled with spools, pliers, wrenches, hammers, and nails. 2 archers lined up to shoot. Only one wanted to know her score. Davis was looking with his binoculars downrange, the length of nearly 2 tennis courts from their location, as one archer let her first arrow fly. I could just hear the sound of a whip cracking the air. It was 7 at 6 o'clock, and then 9 at 2 o'clock. Her shots weren't grouping yet. 10 high, 10 way high. After the next arrow sailed, though, there was no sound. "No, don't look at that one," she said, shifting her feet, dropping her bow. "I don't even think it hit the target." "Yeah," Davis confirmed, "I don't even see it." As I stood behind her trying to place myself in her position, I couldn't imagine how even one had hit the target. Every archer calculates the arc of a rise, the drop and horizontal shifts of an arrow's path, a trajectory only they can predict. Before even accounting for wind speeds, there's always some degree of displacement that happens when an arrow leaves the bow at a skew angle from the target, so that the fletching doesn't catch the string upon release. This is just how the arrow is crafted, so it means that if you're right-handed in archery, you'll aim slightly to the left of the bullseye. The skill means focusing on your mark, the likely shape of an arrow's arched flight, and the many variables that can knock it off all at once. The most precise archers call this process of dual focus split vision. It requires constant reinvention, seeing yourself as a person who can hit a 10 when you just hit a 9, an archer who just hit a 7 but can also hit an 8. It puts archers in rank order of how they measure up against their seconds younger selves. In other words, archers constantly deal with the near win, not quite hitting the mark, but seconds later proving that you can. And I go on to describe how it is a taxing pursuit. Well into a 3-hour practice, 2 of the women were lying down, their backs on the turf behind the shooting line, staring up at the sky. 3 hours per day of meditative focus, trying to find what T.S. Eliot would call the, quote, still point of the turning world, end quote, requires a unique, sustained intensity. Living on a landscape where an infinitesimal difference in degree leads to a massive difference in outcome is what makes an archer an archer. It means learning to have the kind of precision that we find in the natural world, like that of a bee's honeycomb, or the perfect hexagonal shape of the rock formations on Ireland's Giant's Causeway. When archers start getting good, with scores consistently above 1350 out of 1440, they taper down, shoot less, and attend to their concentration, breathing techniques, meditation, and visualization. One teammate, overwhelmed with exams, still made it to Bakersfield because the focus she gets from archery calms her about everything. I stayed at the archery practice for 3 hours. Someone watching me might have wondered why. For all the thrill of discovering a new sport, it was admittedly interminable. I hadn't brought binoculars, and it's hard to concentrate on what's right in front of you but not easily seen. It was a cold day, but I stayed to witness what I was starting to feel I might never glimpse. Gold fever, or target panic, as it's called. What happens when an archer gets good, even too good, compared to her expectations, and starts wanting gold without thinking about the process. In extreme cases, it means one day she's hitting the bullseye, the next day her arrows could end up in the parking lot. No one is clear about whether it's choking, kind of performance anxiety, or some form of dystonia, but what we do know is the only way to recover from it is to start anew, to relearn the motions and to focus on the essentials. None of the archers I saw seems to have target panic. Few are willing to admit it even if they do. Yet something else gripped me about archery enough to keep me there. The reason occurred to me as I left practice walking down Broadway. I stumbled upon a National Historic Landmark, a restored 18th century Dutch colonial farmhouse owned by the Dyckman family. It once stood on acreage that spanned the width of Manhattan from the Hudson to the East River, but is currently nestled on the busy avenue behind shrubs and foliage, raised and hidden nearly out of sight. The incongruity of the farmhouse on Broadway intrigued me, and I went in for a tour. It was, in fact, my second such tour of the day. Watching an archery team in this modern age had been like seeing an ancient relic, a vestige of a past way of work that we rarely spot in action. Not contest where there's a victor, but the pursuit of mastery. The mastery I witnessed on the archery field was not glamorous. There was nobility in it all, but no promise of adulation. There's little that's vocational about American culture anymore, so it's rare to see what doggedness looks like with this level of exactitude, what it takes to align your body for 3 hours to accurately account for wind speeds and hit a target, to pursue excellence in obscurity. It was an unending day in and day out attempt to hit a goal that few will ever glimpse. Perhaps I noticed it more than I would the practice required for more familiar sports, such as basketball or football, ones with more chance of glory or fame. To spend so many hours with a bow and arrow is the kind of marginality combined with seriousness of purpose rarely seen. There was another reason. As every arrow left for its target, the archers were caught between success, hitting the 10 ring, and mastery, knowing that it means nothing if you can't do it again and again. If I had to hazard a guess, I would say that this tension between the two, the momentary nature of success and the unending process required for mastery, is part of what creates target panic in the first place. Mastery requires endurance. Mastery, a word we don't use very often, is not the equivalent of what we might consider its cognate, perfectionism, an inhuman aim motivated by a concern with how others view us. Mastery is also not the same as success, an event-based victory based on a peak point, a punctuated moment in time. Mastery is not merely a commitment to a goal, but to a curved line, constant pursuit. From a certain height, we can see it. Most of our iconic endeavors, from recent Nobel Prize-winning discoveries to entrepreneurial inventions, classic works of literature, dance, and visual arts, were in fact not achievements, but conversions, corrections after an arrow's past flight. I think I'll end there. This is halfway through the introduction of Archer's Paradox. And I'll go on to the first chapter, sort of to continue this idea about mastery. I just want to be mindful of our time. So this section is from this first full chapter called The Unfinished Masterpiece. How often have we designated a work of art or invention, a masterpiece or a classic, an inexhaustible gift, while its creator considers it incomplete, permanently unfinished, riddled with difficulties and flaws, more times than we could possibly know? I considered a partial list. William Faulkner wrote sections of The Sound and the Fury 5 different times after it was already published, adding new writing as an appendix to the novel's later editions. Paul Cézanne worried that he would die, quote, without ever having attained this supreme goal, as he put it, to create a work of art that came directly from nature. He found his body of work wanting. He identified with Fraunhofer, the protagonist in Honoré de Balzac's 1831 short story, The Unknown Masterpiece, this Pygmalion figure whose aesthetic ambition to recreate reality by painting the female form ends in an inevitable failure. Cézanne was he thought his works so often were unfinished that he often set them aside with the intention of coming and picking them back up again, which meant that he left most of his works unsigned. Less than 10% of his paintings bear his signature for this reason. Nobel Prize-winning poet Czesław Miłosz was one of the many who understood this coda. After every book of his poetry came out, he said, "There's always a feeling that you didn't unveil yourself enough." He said, "A book is finished and appears, and I feel, well, next time I will unveil myself. And when the next book appears, I have the same feeling," he says. We thrive when we stay on our own leading edge. It's a wisdom understood by Duke Ellington, whose favorite song out of his repertoire was always the next one, always the one he had yet to compose. Like trying to find the end of a sound wave, the endeavor is never complete. The pursuit of mastery is an ever onward almost. Quote, "Lord, grant that I may desire more than I can accomplish," end quote, Michelangelo implored, like a perpetual Adam with his finger outstretched but not quite touching the Old Testament God's hand in the Sistine Chapel. When Michelangelo was commissioned to paint the vaulted fresco ceiling 65 feet above the ground, he complained of his brain nearly hitting his back, and that he nearly had goiter from the torture of having his stomach squashed beneath his chin and his face doubled as a flying floor for the droppings of paint from his brush above him, as each gesture had become, quote, blind and aimless. He wrote to a friend, "My painting is dead. Defend it for me. I am not in the right place. I am not a painter." Next to it, he drew what looks like a self-portrait. A figure stands, cranes his head, and paints a devil-like face on the ceiling. While laboring over his second cycle on the vault of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, the flood, his plaster mixture sprouted mildew, and a lime mold plagued the work, as if some crude joke. Michelangelo wrote to his patron, Pope Julius I, "I told your holiness that painting is not my art. What I have done is spoiled and has to be replaced." He had left commissions unfinished before. He would leave his works deliberately unfinished so often that it became a style, the non finito, as scholars of his sculpture of figures emerging from rough-hewn stone called it. There's 3 seats if you want them over here. I feel bad if you're standing there. And the public came to know his habit. In the midst of creating a costly bronze statue of the Pope in Bologna for the Basilica of San Petronio, Michelangelo admitted to his brother, "The whole of Bologna was of the opinion I should never finish." Yet his aesthetic of the intentionally incomplete became a metaphor for humility and striving. In this chapter, I spend a great deal of time looking at the way that the unfinished, the near win, gives people a propulsion that they wouldn't have found any other way. I look at the way that this is demonstrated vividly in athletic competition. There's an interesting study that Thomas Gilovich did in the 1990s, which I speak about, in which he looked at the difference between silver medalists and bronze medalists after competition, and found that the frustration that silver medalists feel compared to bronze, who were happy that they didn't receive 4th place and not medal at all, gives silver medalists really a focus on follow-up competitions that bronze medalists don't. So it helps, I think, understand why that coming close, that sense of the incomplete, gives people an onward thrust that creates out of their lives a kind of a journey, as opposed to success, which often feels as if it's a kind of a dead end and a stopping point. So that's, I think I'll end there, but this is what the unfinished masterpiece is about. And because we're in Boston, I thought I would conclude by reading from a chapter that is, in a way, the soul of the book, Beauty, Error, and Justice. And it will offer you a sense of the work that I have to come about the power of aesthetic force. This second book I have is on Harvard University Press, in fact, and I will give you a sense of why it took being in the arts to write this book. Beauty, Error, and Justice, the 2 epigraphs. Over the long run of human history, the constant presence of beauty helps call us to the work of repairing injuries in the realm of injustice. Elaine Scarry. The next one. It fixed me like a statue a quarter of an hour, or half an hour, I do not know which, for I lost all ideas of time, even the consciousness of my existence. Thomas Jefferson. In the face of war, he would ensure that they remembered the power of aesthetic force. Few else would have dared. After all, the crowd was living out the consequences of America's greatest failure with their lives. Nearly 1 in 4 men would die for it during the national fracturing Civil War. They had come to Boston's Tremont Temple to hear what the path towards a true union might mean. No one was expecting to hear what the speaker thought it would take to mend the nation's foundations, though they would listen. For it came from this man, the volcanic, near peerless orator, one of the nation's greatest statesmen in importance, if not in title, who had ended an oracular reputation as that of a prophet, advocating for acts that soon after came to pass: the freedom of enslaved men and women who crossed over into Union territory, arming African Americans in the military, and a president-issued Emancipation Proclamation. At the age of 23, at a time when orators were analogous to star athletes, and the stage could resemble a boxing ring, his will, skill, style, and intellectual prowess proved to nearly all that, quote, "This is an extraordinary man." As one journalist put it, cut out for a hero. As a speaker, he has few equals. He may have sensed that what he was to advocate for was unexpected. He was, after all, a man of action. President Abraham Lincoln, then considered by many of his close advisors to be a failure before his re-election, sought his counsel on the subject of emancipation. Now, in Tremont Temple, what the orator was about to tell the audience seemed like a mere trifle in contrast, but Frederick Douglass was sure, even in the face of war, that the transportive, emancipatory force of pictures and the expanded, imaginative visions they inspire was the way to move toward what seemed impossible. An encounter with pictures that move us, those in the world and the ones it creates in the mind, has a double-barreled power to convey humanity as it is, through the power of the imagination, and to ignite an inner vision of life as it could be. The inward picture-making faculty, Douglass argued, the human capacity for artful, imaginative thought, is what permits us to see the chasm accurately, our failures, the picture of life contrasted with the fact of life. He said, all that is really peculiar to humanity proceeds from this one faculty or power. The distinction of, quote, the ideal contrasted with the real is what made criticism possible. That is, it enabled criticism of slavery, inequity, and injustice of any kind. The words to describe aesthetic force suggest that it leaves us changed, stunned, dazzled, knocked out. It can quicken the pulse, it can make us gape, even gasp with astonishment. Its importance is its animating trait, not what it is, but what it does to those who behold it in all its forms. Its seeming lightness can make us forget that it has weight, force enough to bring about a self-correction, the acknowledgement of failure at the heart of justice, the moment when we reconcile our past with our intended future selves. Few experiences get us to this place more powerfully, with a tender push past the Praetorian guarded doors of reason and logic, than the emotive power of aesthetic force. What forces us to see our errors, collective failures, ones too large to ignore, and personal, perceptual ones of our own? Argument alone is not enough to make men good, Aristotle said. Reason does not govern completely, as the example of Odysseus lured by the siren song shows us. A cogent lecture on the topic by Yale philosophy professor Tamar Gendler outlined the way in which the non-rational takes over in everyday life. using an example of what would happen if we were to stand on a piece of glass at the peak point at the Grand Canyon over the coursing Colorado River. The rational part of us would know that we're safe, but being affected by this visual stimulus is enough to cause physiological sensations, which we may sense as trembling. We all have a blind spot around our privileges, shaped exactly like us, Gino Diaz said, and it can create blindness to failures all around. It results in the Einstein effect. The cost of success is that it can block our ability to see that when what has worked well in the past might not any longer. In the face of entrenched failure, there are limits to reason's ability to offer us a way out. Play helps us see things anew, as do safe havens. Yet the imagination, inspired by an aesthetic encounter, can get us to the point of surrender, making a way for a new version of ourselves. Our reaction to aesthetic force, more easily than logic, is often how we accept with grace that the ground has shifted beneath our feet. Art is a journey into the most unknown thing of all, oneself, architect Louis Kahn stated. Nobody knows his own frontiers. I think I'll end there. Thank you. Let's see. I'd be happy to read more. I want to be mindful of our time and give over enough time for questions.
So,
thank you.
First of all, congratulations.
Well, thank you.
Great book.
Thank you.
I think the first segment might have been in the New Yorker. I read it. It's like
Yeah.
The archer has landed the arrow. Anyway, it's quite good.
Thank you. Thank you.
I do want to ask a question. But I thought the important distinction you make in that first segment in the book, the importance of mastery as opposed to success.
Yes.
But it's also about failure.
Yes.
So I can't resist calling to mind two words of Samuel Beckett. Fail better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
My question is, well, the epigrams to your book, there's four.
Yeah.
One by Abraham Lincoln, Maya Angelou, and I'm trying to remember the third one. I love them all, but I was going to ask you to read the third one, maybe comment on that.
Sure.
So Maya Angelou, Emily Dickinson.
Yep.
So the third one, I can't remember. I don't know why, but maybe perhaps read that if you would. Comment on that in relation to the book, the work, art.
Sure, I'd be happy to. It's such a pleasure coming here. It's such a smart, insightful question. So I'll read all of them if you like, just for the benefit of the audience. They're short. And you can tell me which one you want me to comment on. Okay. The first, we never know how high we are till we are called to rise. Emily Dickinson. My barn having burned down, I can now see the moon. Mizuta Masahide. Men are greedy to publish the success of their efforts, but meanly shy as to publishing the failures of men. Men are ruined by this one-sided practice of concealment of blunders and failures. Abraham Lincoln. We may encounter many defeats, but we must not be defeated. That sounds too goody two-shoes, I know, but I believe that a diamond is the result of extreme pressure and time. Less time is crystal, less than that is coal, less than that is fossilized leaves, less than that and it's just plain dirt. In all my work, in the movies I write, the lyrics, the poetry, the prose, the essays, I am saying that we may encounter many defeats. Maybe it's imperative that we encounter the defeats, but we are much stronger than we appear to be, and maybe much better than we allow ourselves to be. Maya Angelou. So it's the third here is the Abraham Lincoln one that you want me to comment on?
If you want to.
Sure. Well, you know, I was surprised to come across that Lincoln quote, but I agreed with it so wholeheartedly that it could have been the sole epigraph, if not for wanting to show a range of individuals who had also meditated on the topic to remind us of the global nature of this interest. In the 19th century, I think it was a moment where people were trying to understand how it is that we become in a more public way. There are many talks about sort of self-improvement and things of that kind. And as such a titanic leader and orator, I was just struck by his comment that we are ruined by this one-sided practice of concealment, of blunders and failures. I felt that way when I looked out kind of on the sea of books and ideas that were out there that were impacting me, and found that the one thing that we're never taught, the one thing that you can never really learn by reading a book or even looking at someone's interview of, say, an iconic figure, is how it is that someone gleaned advantages from their failures. Oftentimes they're irreplaceable gifts that come from that experience that would never have come from success alone. And I agreed that we are ruined by this one-sided practice. You know, I wrote this book in part because when I failed at failing, right? So I felt that it was, in a way, the thread that could unravel everything else. So I wanted to remind us of how long we've thought this. Over 150 years have passed since he said this, and we are still concealing this story. I hope in this book I've offered one tiny kind of drop into the ocean of more meditations on this topic to come. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, great book. I look forward to
Thank
reading
you.
it.
Thank you.
How do you draw the line between the search for mastery and, as one car company puts it, the relentless pursuit of perfection?
Oh, which car company is that? Is this a commercial I don't know
Lexus,
about?
yeah.
Oh, Lexus. Oh, interesting.
Perfectionism and the search of mastery.
Oh, sure. Okay. So the question is really about the distinction between perfectionism and mastery, and how you know when you're pursuing one versus the other. Is that the question? It's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I think about it when I'm in artist studios. I thought about it when I was watching those archers. One of the distinctions is that mastery requires that you stand on a very internal landscape, looking at that gap between where you are and where it is that you want to go. And it often looks very different to you than it does to the outside world. I've quoted the different masters, you know, Cezanne and Faulkner and others, in part because I wanted to remind us that even when, say, The Sound and the Fury was published and went on to its acclaim, he didn't yet think that it met his goal. There was still a gap for him between where it was and where he wanted it to go. And that gap is what propels mastery. It's what lets it be, lets the endeavor be a journey, because it's never really done, right? One example of this, maybe the most extreme example, is that of Franz Kafka, who saw incompletion where others would find only works to praise, right? So much so that he wanted all of his manuscripts, letters, diaries, and more, sketches, to be burned upon his death, right? He didn't think that they met his goal. One of the works, The Trial, is so incomplete that it was published but even stops mid-sentence. You know, he was still trying to close that gap. And I look at Franz Kafka and don't think that there was perfectionism involved. I think it was this very internal landscape that you start to understand when you get in touch with what someone's own intentions are for their work, you know, not what the world's intentions are for them. That's so much of the work, the sort of soul work, sort of spiritual work of what it means to be in an artist studio. That's why I'm honored to do the work that I do at Yale School of Art. Perfectionism, I guess it's almost a moot point at this stage to say it's really dealing more with what the external world would have you do, opposed to what it is that you would like to do to close that gap between where you are and where you want to go. Is that helpful?
Yes.
That's my view of it.
I happen to be in a hospital for the rehabilitation of stroke patients. And I was observing a class in which people were attempting to learn to walk and to use their arms again. And at one point, the instructor was trying to encourage people to do their best. Mm-hmm. And one man asked the question, how do I know that I've given 100%? And the occupational therapist didn't have an answer, and I suspect that no one in the room had an answer. And I'm kind of wondering what the approach to that kind of answer might be.
Well, I don't know if I have to repeat the question. I think it sounds a bit like a meditation, an extension of this question about how it is that we can close that gap when we know.
But I guess the question is, how do you know that you've given 100% in your attempt, in this particular instance, to regain the ability to walk or use your arms?
Mm-hmm. How do we know that we've given 100%? I love the anecdote that preceded that. You're making me think of the chapter I didn't read from Arctic Summer, Surrender. In that chapter, I speak about the life's work of this Arctic explorer, Ben Saunders, who is the first person in the world to go to the North Pole and back on foot, and now South Pole and back, successfully recreating Captain Robert Scott's failed journey to do so. 3 weeks ago, he just completed that. And I spent 2 years speaking with him because I so wanted to understand where his strength came from to really give 1,000%, right? In order to trudge through sub 50-degree Celsius temperatures with a 200-pound sledge on his back, the size, on a continent the size of the United States that's completely depopulated when he's in the Arctic, and on sheets of ice that were constantly not moving in the direction that he wanted them to go, so that he could trudge a whole day and erase his gains by either sleeping at night or, just by the fact of the ice moving in the opposite direction. And it seemed to be a psychologically harrowing experience. But he, after 2 years, after we spoke about it, he said, I can't think of another word for it but surrender. And by that, he didn't mean giving up, but giving over, to the fact of it. Maybe in this case, it's the fact of the injury, the fact of it, such that you can not resist the circumstance, resist and get frustrated that the ice is moving backwards, but embracing the fact of it, and by doing that, freeing up enough internal resources to give yourself the space to consider how it is that you want to proceed. And in that chapter, the analogy that I love is to think about the way that the martial art of Aikido helps us to practice kind of strategic non-resistance, to be able to give 100% in any circumstance. So Aikido is the one martial art actually that Bruce Lee called the perfect art, because it's the one with no kicks or blows, and the one where you're asked to absorb an incoming attack, and then to be able to redirect that energy into the ground such that you're able to stand in perhaps an even stronger position than where you were before. And to help me understand it, an Aikidoist asked me to envision holding 2 glasses in my hand. One has, say, water in it, and one is empty. She asked me to grip them tightly and to see if I could tell the difference in weight. And I really couldn't tell the difference in weight. And then she asked me to kind of release my grip on them. And then I could tell which one had the water in it and which one was empty, So that kind of surrender, giving up to what you're going through in order to harness maybe unknown resources to you, is what Ben Saunders helped me to understand, and what I would imagine that circumstance I would need to call upon to do what they're doing. Yeah. I have a few more time for questions. Let me get one, and then, Fox.
Well, first of all, thanks for, despite writing a book about the power of failure, for giving such a masterful and voice reading of the book, and for also giving such a masterful, operating such a masterful book itself.
Thank you.
My question is about the gap or the translation between failure and intentionally designed areas such as archery or martial arts or sports, where you, in some way, or even education to some degree, where you're designing assessments, you're designing something which people can fail and possibly get better. Video games are like this. This Flappy Bird game was all about failure that was just released recently. And then the kind of failure that you might encounter just in life and improvisation, interacting with other people, creating artworks, authoring literary works. And so there's a kind of translation that we imagine takes place between the design area of sports and mastery, and you could learn something from Aikido to apply to the real world. But do you touch on that kind of translation and the gaps possible in that translation within the book?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I do. So there are many ways in which I do. This book took took me into many different environments, science labs, to sort of dance stages. And I do look at the way in which this sort of more abstract ideas can be translated into sort of a practical way of working. As it relates to pedagogy, I look a lot at the role of play for path-breaking discoveries. One of my favorite sort of examples of that is talking to these two recent Nobel Prize winners. Actually, this is another sort of Harvard story in a way. These two men, Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoselov, at the University of Manchester, had isolated the first two-dimensional object on the Earth, which physicists didn't think could be done, in fact. They didn't think it was possible. And these two men did it, were not seen as likely candidates to ever win the Nobel Prize because they had, well, Andrei Geim had won the Ig Nobel Award, which is given to someone who does outlandish things, or you're then kind of roasted at Sanders Theater. And you're given 3 weeks to see whether or not you want to accept it because it's so embarrassing to get it. And he won it for levitating a frog with magnets. But he was able to discover something through that. But he reserves, and this is kind of a practical application, one of the many I think about, time in his lab to create what he calls Friday night experiments. Times where his lab does things and is so kind of insouciant and irreverent that they are able to maybe have a ton of failures, which they do. I think 87% of those things are failures. But when they do have a path-breaking discovery, it's of such enormous proportions that they win a Nobel Prize. They found the Nobel Prize, the two-dimensional object, by doing what I also call being a deliberate amateur, and that's the title of that chapter. They deliberately go into fields not in their own area of expertise and ask questions that others wouldn't dare. And their question was, well, if carbon is the main atom that we're working with to discover two-dimensional objects, why are we not just taking kind of Scotch tape and looking at a graphite and a pencil and just ripping it off until we get as thin as possible a sort of surface? And that's what they did, and that's how they found it. And it's so rudimentary and so playful that when they submitted that finding to Nature, the journal, they didn't think that they could possibly have discovered what they did. So Andrei, I think it's a great example of offering a way that we all can import these sort of Friday night experiments into our way of working. Pedagogy, I think, can benefit from thinking about the way in which play should be continue to be structured into our time, regardless of our age. The way that we play looks different, as adults versus children. So while the book is certainly not a self-help book, I don't think readers will be wanting for practical advice of that kind if they seek it. Yeah, sure.
So first, it's just great everything you've done. I think everyone agree. So you look 25 to me, but I did the math and something said. So my brother graduated Harvard 2001. I don't know if you're the same year.
I'm the same year.
Okay, so you was Lowell House.
Oh, wow.
So then I was just at his wedding and met a lot of his college friends. And I think that, so if I listened the whole time, Mr. Brush brought up fail better.
Yeah.
Andy Grove at Intel talks about fail faster.
Uh-huh.
But there's, especially a lot of his friends are lawyers and doctors and things where you're not inventing, but you're excelling. And so then the failure is compared to what's known and then whether you match up versus sitting at Friday night and trying to come up with a 2D graphite. And so all I was going to bring up, and I think what you're getting at, which is great, is it's hard. What does it mean to fail compared to what no one out of the 7 billion people on the planet and the other 20 billion who've lived don't know, versus failing at, if you're trying to learn Spanish and there's a billion people who speak Spanish and you're failing because you can't speak Spanish. So I think it's, so I want to challenge you though, even though everything's great. I think it's useful if your publishers in the audience were to sell books to say that you're talking about failure in a different way. I think you're not talking about failure in the way that the lawyers and the doctors and the non-inventor people talk about failure. So if you fail the bar, you fail the bar. But if you fail at curing cancer tonight, you didn't fail. No one has cured cancer tonight. So you're trying a different approach, and tomorrow you'll try a different approach. So, and if you're in the art studio at the moment and you're coming up with an installation that's trying to get at all of us living nowadays, If you didn't get at it, you'll try again tomorrow. I don't know if the word is failure. I think the word is something else, and I'm not enough of a smart person to come up with that. So, but I think so. Then, therefore, you're talking about something else, which is core. But I don't know if you're talking about failure, because in the connotation of the denotation of failure,
Yeah.
you're getting at. I think what people. So, therefore, it's a different kind of sense, but you're getting at it. But I think it's a little unfair to put people as that we think too much about failure. We do but that kind of failure is good failure. It's like if you're trying to learn something that other people know, that is failure if you haven't learned it yet. But if you're trying to discover, it's not failure. And I think you're getting a discovery.
Yes. So the question is really about the difference between how failure operates in the context of discovery versus how failure operates in really everyday life,
Yeah.
right? And it's a distinction I've thought long and hard about, and this book is really focused in the arena of innovation
Yeah.
and how new ideas happen and the importance of failure for those
But that would be a
feats.
trying. Experimentation, I think, is the
Yeah.
word you're getting at.
Well,
Experimentation is
that's part of it. Yeah, that's part of
I'm trying
it.
to be a scientist. I understand experimentation.
So what I do spend some time though thinking about when failure is final, when failure is operates in public and does mean that you have simply not achieved what it is that you want, and the benefits that come from that even still. I spend less time on it, but I do speak about it. But I just want to read, I guess, just a paragraph or 2 paragraphs from the introduction,
I love everything
just to
you do, and I
understand.
need to challenge you.
No, it's a great challenge because I deal with it head on in the book, and I simply say, this book rarely uses the word failure, though it's at the heart of its subject. The word failure is imperfect. Once we begin to transform it, it ceases to be that any longer. The term is always slipping off the edges of our vision, not because it's hard to see without wincing, but because once we are ready to talk about it, we often call the event something else. A learning experience, a trial, a reinvention, no longer the static concept of failure. The word was, after all, not designed for us, but to assess creditworthiness in the 19th century, a term for bankruptcy, a seeming dead end forced to fit human worth. Perhaps a 19th century synonym comes closer, blankness, a poetic term for the wiping clean that this experience can provide. It hints too at the limitlessness that often comes next. Trying to find a precise word to describe the dynamic is fleeting, like trying to locate francium, an alkali metal, measured but never isolated in any quantity or seen in any way that the eye can detect. One of the most unstable, enigmatic elements on the earth. No one knows what it looks like in an appreciable form, but there it is, scattered throughout the earth's crust. So I end by saying, partial ideas do exist, resilience, reinvention, and grit, but there's no one word to describe the passing, yet vital, constant truth that just when it looks like it's winter, it's spring. So I hope that answers your question.
2 thumbs up.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Do we have any other questions?
When you were sitting in this bookstore planning this, you did it.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Sarah.
Hi.
I just had a question, just in regards to artists as they're chasing this ideal versus the reality that they live in. I just wanted you to speak on that, because a lot of times you're coming closer to the ideal of what it is that you envision for yourself, and sometimes that ideal is placing you further away from reality.
Yeah. Well, you're asking the question is about how artists can continue on a journey when their ideal that they might be coming closer to is actually pulling them farther away from the realm of just kind of public life, everyday life. Yeah. One of the things I see happen when an artist gets close to their own vision is that there start to become 2 realities of a certain kind. The reality that you're within in terms of where you are in relationship to your intention, how you're able to close the gap between the effect of your work and the intention of your work. And then there's the reality of whether the public has yet caught up to it and whether they've seen it. So I think of someone like a Herman Melville, right? When he published Moby Dick, I love this line he said, "Though I have written the Gospels of this century, I will die in the gutter." He knew it. He knew what he had done. He knew what reality he was in and that he had closed his gap, but he knew that the other reality wouldn't yet see that and didn't for 70 years. So what I always encourage artists to do is to remember that they are in lineage in that way, and to know that they are ahead of the breakers. You know, artist's job is often to offer that kind of lighthouse sight. That means that sometimes you are in an isolated position, but that you are in service in a way when you do so. So that's what I always say to my students. One of the things I'd say much more if I had more time, but yeah. Any other questions? It's okay? Okay. We have time for maybe one last one, otherwise I'm happy to sign away. I'm just trying to take a mental photograph of all of you as I stand here. Okay, do you want to ask one last one?
I just wanted to follow up because
Sure.
I wasn't actually asking about the difference between sort of practice and theory and some abstract world. What I meant was something more like, Jesper Juhl wrote a book called The Art of Failure. And Jesper Juhl is actually a video game studies scholar. And that's also the area I work in with artificial intelligence and similar areas. And the issue is that in this kind of area, you actually you know the rules. You're actually designing, in some sense, a system in which people can fail and get better. Then they have the experience of improvement, and that's sort of a space where play or fun or these other kind of experiences occur. And martial arts, to some degree, you know, at least a set of movements. And so it's a kind of domain in which there is some kind of constraints. But in the world of discovery and in other areas, you don't have these kind of design constraints. And so the idea is that in something like Aikido, you have these constraints, but then you can apply it to the larger world, maybe philosophically in some way. But there might be some limits in this area where you have these constraints, like in sports. How much can you learn about the experience of winning, losing, and failure in sports that will apply when you face the bar exam, like the other speaker, the other questioner asked. And so then the question is just about what's the role of the kind of designing these experiences, like you and I talk about in the art of failure, designing systems for failure, and then failure in the world where you don't have those kind of rules that are designed.
That's interesting. So what's the role of spaces and structures where we design an experience where we can kind of experience failure to help in the real world? Well, one of the final chapter is called The Grit of the Arts. And there I look at the way in which grit is so critical. Grit, as Angela Duckworth, a psychologist down at University of Pennsylvania, the positive psychology there, describes it as one of the best indicators for achievement in school age children, more so than IQ or talent alone, right? But grit is the ability to persevere in the face of failure feedback. And when you mentioned video games, and Fox is a great scholar at MIT Media Center there, and Media Lab there, and you're making me think of actually when I was a child, I would play all these video games, and I would actually fail at whatever level I was trying to get to, but there was something that would rise up in me to make me want to do it again. And I hadn't until this moment thought about how that is a simulator of sorts for the kind of grit that's so critical in life in general. But I did challenge, productively, Angela, in thinking about grit, because grit is one of the few things that you can't really teach, at least not yet. They haven't found a way. So my engagement with her was about the way in which the arts, and I would extend that to technology and video games and this digital realm in general, can operate as a simulator of sorts. In that chapter, and I'll just end by saying I offer a kind of a timeless example of this. Samuel Morse, the life of Samuel Morse is one that we know as that of an inventor who created the telegraph, but what people often forget, and as an art historian I don't, which is that he spent 26 years in the pursuit of being a painter of great renown, right? He wanted to be someone like a Michelangelo or a Titian or a Rembrandt, but yet when he went to exhibit his paintings up and down, from Boston to New York mainly, doing so put him in debt. He couldn't support his family. He moved to New York and said, well, if I am to live in poverty, I might as well be there as opposed to anywhere else. And the classic struggling artist. And when he hit this nadir and he didn't think he could continue as a painter, he converted the stretcher bars of the canvas into the telegraph itself, And he describes in these extensive letters over his course of his life how the process of finding enough agency to figure out how you're going to move forward as you create a painting or anything else helped him with the grit required to persevere and find the patent, for the telegraph. So there's some examples of this that might be interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. One more. Okay. Yeah. Please.
So I wonder about those people who cannot gather the grit, and they really
Yeah.
give up.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that? I've read your magnificent book, of course, but
Yeah. What happens to those who can't gather?
yeah, the spirit just.
Well, this is a great question. I think, in a way, you're making me wish I'd read a bit more from Surrender.
Yeah.
In Surrender, it's one of the few times where I also speak about my own experience here at Harvard and what happened beyond that. Because there was a moment for me where I felt like I couldn't gather. I was sort of all at loose ends, and it was because of a period of compound grief that I went through, where a number of my friends, a few that I went to Harvard with, died in quick succession. And it brought me so low that it made me really wonder, it made me think about why I was here and what I wanted to do with my time here differently than I had considered it before. I hadn't thought about what got me through that period, and I don't even know if I really was through that period, which occurred in my young 20s, until I talked to Ben Saunders about this idea of surrender. And I remember the next morning after he was explaining to me what surrender meant for him, I woke up and I wrote in my moleskin, where I pretty much drafted this whole book, kind of just writing through tears, kind of a release of a kind of grief that I didn't realize still had a stranglehold on me to a certain extent. That I, in that moment, realized that what got me through was wanting to live my life in a way that showed my gratitude for the fact that I am here. And doing so, I realized, would mean that I might have to do things like take the risk of writing a book when I'm doing a PhD at Yale and doing all other sorts of things that might seem like failure to others, or might even be a failure to others, in order to be my fullest self, So surrender in that moment, I realized, is a way of being, not simply if you're out on the Arctic, but how you have to start to see your life when you come to that moment when you are kind of starfished, on the ground. So I guess I'd end by saying I thought about how much surrender helped me, how much it still helps me. It's helping me kind of right now. With the story of Martin Luther King Jr., who I mentioned, received those C's in oratory class. That was one of the moments where I knew I was going to write the book. But he developed.
Why did you receive a C?
Oh, I don't know. Well, this might answer you. The story. At the end of his life, I don't think anyone knows. No one really, even his family. I tried to interview them about it. They don't know. But he developed later in his life a speech impediment. This verbal tic. He might have had it again back then. I don't know. And a few of his friends noticed this tic before he would go on stage. And eventually one of his friends, Harry Belafonte, asked him about it. And because eventually the tic went away. And Harry Belafonte wanted to know why. And he said, well, Harry, I made my peace with death, he said. And when I did that, I realized that I had nothing left to fear. And then the tic just went away, he said. So I think coming to a point of surrender to what it is that we're really ultimately fearing, for me, was what got me through. It let me become a person I didn't think I could be through writing this book, through taking myself through that growth process. So I think there's some lessons in surrender for anyone at loose ends. Does that answer?